Hello everybody, welcome to ConsciousCtrl and welcome to part 2 of the flow state series. So in part 1, I kind of introduced flow states and described what they are, and in this video I'm going to go a bit more into depth about the different requirements and aspects of being in a flow state. Be aware that these aren't hard criteria that will 100% put you into a flow state. They're more of just generalized and agreed upon aspects of flow states. As I said in my last video, nobody really has all the answers here when it comes to this. So a little bit of self-exploration, your own personal experiences, should always be paired with the information and the content that you consume to create your own beliefs and perspectives. If you remember the guy who coined the term flow states, Mihaly from part 1, he said that in order to get into a flow, there's certain prerequisite conditions that must be met. And those 3 conditions are going to be a skill to challenge ratio, clear goals, and immediate feedback. So first you have the skill to challenge ratio. If you want to get into a flow state in whatever it is that you're doing, it has to be challenging relative to your capabilities. Challenge has to be high enough to push you outside of your comfort zone, but not so high that you don't have the required skills to actually achieve the goal. A game is only fun when there's a chance to win, but that chance isn't too high or too low. And that's one of the reasons that video games are actually so easy to get into a flow state with. In any video game, you start out with essentially no skills, but you also start out with really easy challenges. As you progress, you get more skills, and the challenges that you face become equally harder. If you skip too many steps, you start to face challenges that are outside of your skill level, and it no longer becomes fun. And on the flip side, if you acquire too many skills for the challenges available to you, you become overpowered. So obviously there's a bit of variance in the skill to challenge ratio. It depends on the person and it depends on the task, but I believe that your innate resilience as a person can also increase the gap between the level of the challenge and the skills required. And that can also increase the depth of your flow, meaning that if you have really high resilience in your personality, you can get into deeper flow states while aiming for challenges that are slightly outside of your comfort zone, slightly further outside of your skill level. It also means that your success rate will go down, granted, but your resilience is a natural barrier against the anxiety that failure would normally bring. And this translates really well into life. If you look at circumstantial upbringing, challenges in one's childhood compared to success as an adult, it's heavily dependent on resilience and grit. You can put 2 children into the same terrible childhood, and one may come out an entrepreneur, a CEO, a successful person, and the other may come out in the opposite end of the spectrum. And that is largely dependent on their resilience and grit as a person. Resilience and grit can turn failure into a less negative aspect and more of a competitive one, which is essential for growth. So the second criteria is fairly straightforward. It's clear goals. The aim of the challenge or the object of the game has to be well known and obvious, a clear result to strive for, and an intention to have in mind. For example, in video games, the objective is usually literally outlined for you. Or in sports, the goal is to score or to win. In music, it's to recreate the sounds that you're hearing in your head. In order to get into a flow state, you have to know what you have in mind. You have to know what your goal is and what your intention is. Again, feed that back into real life. If you want to get into a flow state simply in life, you have to do what? You have to outline your goals. You have to live with intention. How many times have you heard people say that? The last criteria is going to be immediate feedback. So in addition to knowing what your goals are and having the skills to achieve them, you have to be able to tell if what you're doing is actually working or not. You have to be able to see that you're getting closer to that goal as opposed to further with each action that you do in real time, so that you can adjust your behavior accordingly. In order to sustain your attention and your motivation and build into a flow state, feedback has to be immediately available. If you're making music, the things you hear either sound right or they don't. It's a form of intuition. That hearing, that intuitional response is immediate feedback. In sports, you either score or do what you intended to do, or it fails. If you have to wait 5 minutes for every result of every action that you did, it would be impossible to get into a flow state because you would be disrupted in that time period. The feedback has to be immediate and obvious. Now, even with these 3 conditions met, it's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to get into a flow, right? But it is more likely. It's a framework. So flow comes from the full engagement with the task. Full engagement comes from a balance of curiosity and motivation driving your attention. Attention and motivation drive creativity and effort. It's a perfect storm of all these factors that result in your optimal performance in whatever it is that you're doing, keeping things like anxiety, distractions, self-doubt, uncertainty from restricting you. Now, those are some basic prerequisite requirements for being in a flow state. There's also some key identifiable aspects of being in a flow state that you can use to kind of help understand when you were in one or when you weren't in one. People like Cutler of the Flow Genome Project take a perspective that if you can recreate the conditions that are required to be in a flow state, and you can embody some of the characteristics of someone who is in a flow state, then naturally with those two things together, you're more likely to actually fall into a flow state, which theoretically makes a lot of sense. Flow states are so interesting and powerful and addictive that Cutler's actually spent most of his career chasing and trying to harness the power of flow states for himself and other people. That's the value here. So the main characteristic of a flow state is also, ironically, the reason for needing to be able to identify these characteristics in the first place, which is the loss of consciousness. When you're truly in a deep flow state, your ego completely disappears. Your sense of self and the voices in your head go silent. That's why on social media you see people making videos that are something along the lines of, I love basketball, or I love football, or I love dance because it's the only thing that when I go do it makes the voices go silent. It's the only thing that gives me peace of mind. And that's exactly what they're talking about. The reason why is because when you're in a flow state, all the resources for self-oriented thought in your brain are being used elsewhere. And for the time period that you're in that flow, the channel that could shift your attention back inwards, back into your head, towards those processes involving self-thought are actually kept shut, leaving your sense of self outside of your conscious awareness in order to allow the flow to continue uninterrupted. Your brain has these mechanisms in place through thousands of years of evolution to be able to allow you to sustain a flow state under the right conditions. So keeping that channel of self-oriented thought shut off is actually what allows you to go unconscious. And it's why you don't even often realize that you were in a flow until you've already come out of it. And those self-oriented thought processes regain power because your sense of self was unconscious during the flow state. It had to be, because your brain had to conserve those resources. And that goes hand in hand with the second aspect of flow states, which is an altered sense of time. As I said earlier, moments seem longer because you're present for each passing frame of time. But long time periods seem shorter because as you're present for each moment, they sort of blur together. Your increased presence also brings a sense of short-term memory. You're not consciously aware of anything outside of this sort of 20-second time window of presence. So that loss of consciousness and time distortion are both intrinsically connected because they both arise from the internal network, or the default mode network, which is what has its activity suppressed during flow state. This is actually called transient hypofrontality. So your Salience Network, which is a network that prioritizes information and prioritizes the flow of your attention based off of what's important at the time, prioritizes the more task-oriented networks during the flow state. Networks like your control network, your attention networks, your visual network, your sensory motor network, all of these during a flow state. And it's also what keeps that channel for the internal network closed while you're in a flow state, ideally. So during that time period, while there's a lack of interference from the internal network, that's what allows the third and fourth characteristics of flow to persist, which are action and awareness merging and peak concentration. So the internal network is often disrupted. It's a highly fluctuating network that siphons attention away from the task at hand a lot. Motivation is necessary to allow the Salience Network to stop the internal network from doing that. Motivation is what gives the Salience Network the context to prioritize. So with those channels being closed during a flow state, your mind is actually able to bypass the step between action and awareness, which in this case would be thought and consideration, and reduces the gap between the two as they quickly merge. So what that means is, during a flow state, there's no thought, there's no hesitation, there's no step in between you perceiving your environment and reacting to it. You're just reading and reacting, nothing else involved in theory. Now, me personally, I wonder how intuition comes into play here. There is still processing happening in the brain somehow, but it's being streamlined. You're using a different kind of intelligence, one that's guided by your gut instead of your higher level mind, your higher level consciousness. And we know that the two are intrinsically connected, your gut and your higher mind. So you actually have a large amount of neurotransmitters in your gut, in your digestive tract. And neurotransmitters are the chemical signals that carry information in the brain, which, when you think about it contextually, makes a lot of sense. In fact, serotonin, which is stereotypically known as the happy chemical, but it actually has a lot of different uses and value in the brain. About 90% of the serotonin that's produced in your body is actually produced in your digestive tract. Now think about gut feelings, intuition, that pit you get in your stomach when certain things happen or don't happen. I think there's a lot of depth here to the concept of intuition and gut feelings that we know very little about, but it's obviously intrinsically connected to flow states. There's a lot more research to be done there. So along with action and awareness merging is the fourth characteristic, which is peak concentration. The longer your flow goes uninterrupted, the more it allows you to fall deeper and deeper into focus until essentially 100% of your attention is being funneled through those task-oriented networks that we talked about earlier. There's a finite amount of attention in the brain, and it's used as a currency. So you're subconsciously always prioritizing how to best spend that currency, how to pay attention. When you're in a flow, the brain makes the judgment that the task at hand, the thing that you're doing, is currently worth every bit of attention that you have if you can actually manage that. And so instead of your attention being divided, which it almost always is to some extent, for this one moment, for this time period of a flow state while you're doing whatever it is that you're doing, it's not divided. It's centered, it's stable, and it's powerful. So that being said, the main task-oriented network in the brain is the control network. And this is the fifth identifiable characteristic of a flow state, which is the feeling of control. You know what you need to do, you know that it's difficult, but you also know that you can do it, and through every action you see the immediate effect of what you caused. You're in total control of the outcome based on the variables that you're given and the choices that you make, and you also believe that that's the case, and that's extremely important. In basketball, when I'm in a flow state and I miss a shot to the left, I know it's not bad luck. I know it's because my release was slightly left or slightly late, and I know that I have to correct that error the very next shot, and it will go in. I'm in control of the results, and therefore I have a higher motivation to act in whatever way necessary to get to the goal that I know I'm capable of achieving. Thus, I feel like I'm in control of the moment. And with that, you have an inherent confidence, something that's unbreakable. For example, you've heard the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? Well, in a flow state, these principles are implied. There's not even any consideration of the things you can't change. You're not conscious of those things. And for once in your life, you're in total control of everything around you, or at least, again, you feel like you are, and that's important. So that guy I mentioned earlier, Stephen Cutler, he's made a lot of contributions to the study of flow throughout his career, and he's proposed some of his own characteristics through those studies. A major one being that flow occurs in high stakes situations. He studies a lot of extreme athletes, adrenaline junkies, or things like that, where they require you to be super present, super aware in make or break situations and react very quickly. Me personally, I think that's a very valid contribution because from my perspective, flow was most likely developed as some form of psychological evolution. Life for humans was always fragile. There was no shortage of ways to die. Childbirth itself had a 50% mortality rate. Sickness and injury claimed another 50% before the age of 5. One cut could turn into a bacterial infection and you're dead within days. And even if you made it out of adolescence, you had to worry about the biggest cause of death in history, which is other people. Culturally and socially, combat and sport were equally a quick way to die, and because of that, success in those things was selected for in society. If you did well in sports, if you did well in battle, you were heralded as having honor, and your house was promoted, and you got physical and life rewards for being able to perform in the moment. Meaning, if you're in a moment where your life is on the line and it's make or break, you either perform well and at your best and give yourself a chance to survive, or you don't, and you're dead, and your story ends. Being able to be at your absolute 100% capacity to perform is important. If your child's life is on the line, if your mother or brother or sister's life is on the line, and you have the chance to do something about it, you better do something about it. And if you don't, you die, or they die. In this way, I think flow was a form of psychological evolution. High stakes situations can increase your chances of getting into a flow state, can increase the depth of a flow state that you get into, but only if you're able to actually pass that threshold in the moment. Meaning the proportion of the risk to flow ratio, right? Like the level of risk in the moment to the depth of the flow state that you get into is probably linear, it's probably proportionate. But if you can't achieve that flow, then higher risk only means higher consequences, which is certainly quite the paradox. And it's also interesting because we now live in a society where those situations are extremely rare for the average person's life. Have any of you ever read the book City of Thieves? It's a really, really good book by David Benioff. I love that book. The book, I believe, is about a young Russian in the time of World War I, where the Russians are fighting the Germans. He lives in a city in Russia, which because of the war was extremely poor. People were rationing for food, etc., etc. But anyways, near halfway through the book, the cabin that they're in, that he's hiding in with his friends, the main character, is being raided by Nazis, right? They're chasing after them through the woods, shooting. He's watching people die left and right to him as he's running away from these Nazis getting shot at. The way he writes about it is that there is no form of thought. There's no consciousness in that moment. Your legs, you're not thinking about where to run, where your legs steps. You're simply doing it. It's immediate, it's instinctual. There's a moment where he looks to his side and watches his friend literally get shot and explode and die. He doesn't even think about it. There's no reaction. He has to keep running because if he doesn't, he's going to die too. And that's an example of a situation where the risk ultimate and the flow state is equally as ultimate. He's in his 100% peak capability because he has to be able to get out of that moment to survive. So another big thing that Stephen Cutler talks about is this triangle of learning, creativity, and motivation. And basically the idea is that while you're in a flow state, all three of those things are heightened. With learning, you're processing and encoding information more deeply and immediately as you're interacting with the environment, and that increases your learning. Your brain is having improved lateral thinking and pattern recognition, linking new ideas together really well, and that increases creativity. Also, your motivation is very high for all the things we just talked about, but also because the experience itself is what's called autotelic. Autotelic means you're doing it for the sake of doing it. You're going through the experience just for the sake of going through the experience. It's intrinsically rewarding, and therefore you're extremely motivated to continue doing it. Part of this is because there's also a huge chemical influence going on behind the scenes in your synapses. This feedback loop of having those clear goals, along with completing those goals, along with incrementally still having new challenges being presented and immediate feedback, turns it all into this type of game that's extremely addicting to your reward pathways in your mind. Your brain's synapses are releasing adrenaline, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, anandamide, and others while you're in a flow state. And these are the neurochemicals that drive most of your experiences in life. Like, as a human, you feel so much and your mind interacts with the environment so much. And oftentimes we take substances that make us feel less because we feel so much more. We take things like Xanax, we take things like Zoloft, and those things are designed to essentially level you out, mellow you out, and make you feel less because we feel so much as people. But at the same time, feeling those things, getting those chemicals, receiving that chemical information is part of what makes you alive, and it's part of what life is about. So when you're in flow state, you're feeling all these things, but it feels good. It's intrinsically rewarding. And because of that, it's also addicting. Flow, just like love, just like passion, is a drug, and it has chemical effects on you. So overall, those are the main aspects of flow states. I went into a pretty good amount of depth, but in the next video, I'm gonna go into even more depth about how to actually get into flow states, how to set up the circumstances, but also to how to train your mind to be able to fall into a flow state more easily. So for example, you want to learn how to dunk a basketball, or you want to learn how to do a backflip. And those two are different things because, for example, let's say you're training to be able to do a handstand push-up, right? Where you're on your head and you can just completely press yourself while completely balanced. There's two ways to go about that. You can either practice it every single day, in which you eventually will get there. You'll eventually be able to do that. But if you want to speed that process up or make it easier, you're also going to go and work out. You're going to go and train your arms and your shoulders and your balance and things like that to speed up the process, to give your body the foundation that it needs to be able to do that movement more easily. So that's what conscious control is about here, and that's where flow states comes into play with conscious control. I'm going to try and teach you not only how to, in your life with habits and behaviors, to set up the conditions required to get into a flow state, but also how to train your mind to be able to accommodate flow states more easily, to be able to fall into a flow state more easily, and eventually, with enough control, be able to activate flow states whenever you'd like to. So stay tuned for part 3. I'll see you next time.